welcome to the Prostar Underground Utilities podcast. My name is Chad Smeltzer. I'm your host. Today's guest is Justin Guerra, who's with Texas Rural Water Association, and obviously Paige Tucker, who's the CEO at Prostar. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, how's it going?
Now, before this, we were just doing all this conversation about rural communities and asset management and all this stuff. But before we jump into that, Justin, give us a little background, introduction for yourself.
All right. My name is Justin Guerra, born and raised in South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley area. I did an enlistment in the Marine Corps, did a deployment to Afghanistan, some exercises in Africa. When I came back, I studied geography at UTSA. That's where I was introduced to GIS. From there, I applied and implemented GIS applications to municipalities, specifically in the wastewater and water distribution systems.
Nice. Now, Paige, we should probably walk through a little introduction of you. I know we did the first two episodes about you, but go ahead and do a little quick introduction, please.
Yeah, my name is Paige Tucker. I'm the CEO and founder of Prostar, and we have designed the world's leading precision mapping solution, which addresses the ability to map precisely where critical infrastructure is, both above and below ground. And our real niche in the market is the ability to identify where utilities and pipelines are buried below the ground down to the centimeter, including the depth. And we do that in real time. And we've designed a real simple cloud and mobile solution that just works on any standard smart device, like your Apple phone or your Android phone, or in some cases, some of our clients are using tablets.
Awesome. All right, Justin, we were talking about today rural communities, and obviously you're in Texas, so you get the experience of all the communities, the smaller ones, the bigger ones, within Texas. What does it look like for you on a day-to-day basis when you go into these smaller communities, as far as like utilities and where everything's at?
Oh, it kind of feels like being Indiana Jones. You're going through, because again, my first approach is always, hey, what historical data, historical maps that I can use a baseline to start some kind of GIS mapping of their utilities. So usually it's somewhere in some dusty room. It looks like parchment paper from Egyptian times, and that's kind of how most of their asset management is also contained. It's always paper based, somewhere in a drawer that only some specific person knows where to look, and even then, it takes them a while to get there. So, yeah, usually starting that mapping service is kind of like you're hitting against the grind in a sense, because you're trying to assemble all these parts so you can start creating that baseline map for them. So that's usually how it is when I come into these rural systems. It's, hey, what is there that I can start designing your map for?
Yeah, interesting. Paige, that's your experiences too. We were kind of alluding to that earlier before we started the podcast with some.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, the smaller communities in rural areas that don't necessarily have the resources to have a robust GIS system. Everything is still paper based, and it's in a file drawer, and it's in different file formats. It's a pretty arduous process, if you will, and that is if they have maps, because a lot of assets, you're talking, they're aging. They're could be 50 to 100 years old, well before we even had mapping systems. So a lot of times you rely on human knowledge, someone that's been at the organization for a long time that may or may not know where things are, based on kind of a general idea of what the location is, but that person is not always there for too long.
Yeah, that's true. With all the retirement that's going on right now, that's got to be scary for a lot of smaller utilities that they really won't have any information from the person that's retiring, who's got it in their head, all the knowledge, right? So they're sitting there with those cabinets full of those paper files, and what are they going to do with it? I mean, What does it look like, Justin, when you walk in and you like start collecting this information, and how do you process it right now?
Oh, I kind of have to develop like kind of a system, kind of go from the oldest, build off of the oldest as builds, go on to the newer ones, and then once I even draw the baseline map, then I even sit down with the operators and go through all the changes that might be, because even though the as builds show that a line goes on this particular side of the road, the operator would tell you, well, yeah, it was designed that way, but due to some kind of certain circumstances, they had to deviate from that. So instead of going on that side, it crossed over and whatnot. So that's where I kind of have to establish that baseline with them is going through all the historical maps, sorting it through it out, and then going based off of what the operator says. But again, that comes tricky when say, hey, that operator is no longer there.
Mm.
I come across that a lot of times, like, hey, Mr. Smith back in the day, he could have told you where this was at, but unfortunately, they came during a time where that transition period wasn't taking place, so that knowledge is lost.
Yeah.
So that's where you start coming into those where, okay, you have to start using null values or unknowns or to that effect.
Yeah. When you
I
say
was just going to say,
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just going to say, so a lot of times, if there are as-built drawings, those are the original design drawings on how the assets, were going to be placed, particularly utilities and pipelines. But then it's up to the contractor, if you will, where he's going to place them. And there's a lot of factors that can come into play when you're actually doing the installation. I mean, where you're going to place them may be over congested already, with current infrastructure. So you might put it 3 or 4 meters away from, where it was intended to go. Or a lot of times, because they're paid to put them in the ground as quickly as possible, they might just put them on the other side of the road. But that's the right of way. And as long as it's close enough, then they'll sign off on those as-built drawings. But the problem is then those as-built drawings actually become the system of record of where those utilities and pipelines were placed. And almost all the time, not sometimes, the as-builts are not correct. Plus, say for example, if it's a gas line, let's say it's supposed to be 6 feet in the ground. Is it actually 6 feet in the ground? No, it's never 6 feet in the ground. I mean, it could be 6 feet in one spot, 5 in another, maybe even 3 in another. And then they go by things like curbs. So it's supposed to be offset, 1 meter or 3 feet from the curb. So they think that's where it is, when in reality, two things can come into play. If that was based on, information from 30 years ago, that curb's probably been moved a few times because the road's probably been widened a couple times or even moved, based on subdivision. So what we call geospatially, those records are simply not accurate.
Mm. So what it sounds like from Justin's experience and yours is when a project or development gets put into a community, right? What really goes out in the specifications versus what the contractor goes out and is like, well, we can't put it here because there's too much rock or something like that. Just thinking of what the construction site would look like. They have to
Yep.
do things that are different, and it doesn't sound there's definitely a disconnect from like there's a from the engineers who designed or developers whatever to where the construction guys are actually putting the infrastructure.
You just nailed it. I mean, basically, the design drawings. It's kind of like no one's opened up the earth, so they don't know what's down
Right.
there, and it's heavily congested now. So, in a perfect case scenario where you're designing where the utilities and pipelines are going to go into the ground, it looks pretty simple. Once you open up the ground and take a look and see what's there, like you said, there's a lot of factors that come into play where you're going to have to make several adjustments on actually where you're placing the utilities. I mean, as-built drawings are based on perfectly straight lines. When the
Yes.
utility actually goes into the ground, in most cases, it's almost like a serpent's trail.
Yep, yep. And that's another thing that I came across was like the as builds. They're usually not delivered until like 3, 4, 5 years after the fact that it's already gone, drawn out and constructed. So again, like say with these municipalities, they wouldn't get a reference of that as built till 5 years after the project is done. So again, and then those little deviations from what the as builds say, you'd be lucky if the engineer penciled that in and properly labeled it, or just left it as is. And now that's, again, it's now part of the record of history, and it's inaccurately put. So you come across that quite a bit sometimes, especially when um, with the timelines between projects, you know.
It,
In addition to that, even if you do have a GIS system,
Mhm.
most of the data is coming from the as-builts.
Correct.
So you're entering into
Correct.
the GIS system the information that's coming from the as-built. Ideally, what you would do is that during installation, you would digitally record precisely where that utility is going into the ground, and then
Mhm.
that becomes what we consider a precision record. I mean, we get it down to the centimeter, so you know exactly where it is, and then of course we measure the depth as well.
Correct. When I was with the city of Galveston, I would always tell them, I'll be off doing other projects, but I would tell them whenever, an asset is installed, before any backfilling has occurred, call me. Give me a call. I'll drive wherever I'm coming from, and I will record that point. Just because, again, I know once it's backfilled, it's going to be nearly impossible to get back to that asset. And again, while you're there, take photos of it. So again, you can record the way the asset was prior to being backfilled. So whenever you do repairs, you do have a baseline to kind of reference off of.
That's a great point. And with the technology today, you can do all that from your cell phone.
Exactly.
so here, I'm going to get to like, here's the disconnect though. You got the engineer who's already working on another project. While that project's completing, they cover everything up and they're supposed to pencil it in, like you said, Justin. But obviously, they're on to something else. So that's not getting recorded, like you said, because they're already moving past
Mm-hmm.
that project. But the other thing is, it's like, who's overseeing these projects of when it,
Yeah.
how are we not like grabbing the data as we're covering up these, underground infrastructure? Like, who's responsible?
I would I would- I would say it would just be the practices. So like when you're coming to like say municipalities, their municipalities, some are just getting into the technology portion of GIS, GPSing, of data collecting and whatnot. So again, a lot of these municipalities are very slow in acquiring this data at that time. So it gets lost in that sense. Um, so like you typically would want an inspector, you have city inspectors and overseeing all these changes, and it gets lost in that communication between the city inspector, whoever's doing the data recording and whatnot. So there's a lot of miscommunication between the two of what I've seen. More so with the rural systems, it's just the operator if you're lucky to have them out there, because again, when there's a leak, you get a call for a leak or a major main break, you're pulling that person out of that project, and now you have nobody overseeing that project. So again, that's where you're leaving kind of the wolves to the sheep.
It's
If
true.
I can, if I can just elaborate on that a little bit. So the way we designed the system, and this is where I talk about efficiencies in workflows, is we're cloud based. So you could have 10 projects going on where they're installing utilities and pipelines, and a professional, be it an engineer or a surveyor, or as you mentioned, just an inspector, can actually sit in his office and he can see what's going on all 10 of those projects. We
Mhm.
can actually set parameters where if it's not going into the ground within, let's just say it has to be 4 centimeter accuracy. If they get outside of that recording, it'll actually notify them that they're not placing it
Mhm.
correctly. And the American Society for Civil Engineers,
That is.
yeah, the ASC used to be ASC 3802. The standard and guidelines where you had to have a professional on site, as you say, mentioned even an inspector to determine what the accuracy was and to make sure that it was following the guidelines and standards. Based on our software last year, American Society for Civil Engineers changed their guidelines and standards and says that based on the data that our software PointMan is providing, a professional can actually sit in his office
Mhm.
and determine if it's meeting the guidelines and standards. And that's why we create the efficiency, because you don't have to have so many boots out in the field, and you can get a lot more work done and make sure that it's being done correctly from your office.
That sounds neat.
because if you think about it, from what Justin's saying and what you're saying, Paige, Justin's saying there's a disconnect. The inspector's going out, no one's tracking it, obviously, because they got multiple projects or they just left the job. Like they got too many things going on. And Paige, you're saying that obviously you can manage multiple projects with a technology like Point Man. And if I guess my point with this is there's so many projects going on across this country right now. Just think of all the data that we're missing out on that is currently happening right now, just because we aren't implementing this technology, and having it in place. It's wow. I mean, it's a lot. Like,
Yeah,
it's if you
exactly.
really think about it, and how much of this is happening right now as we're talking in the country, we have no.
Well, I'll give you an example. So as we mentioned, and this is kind of where the connection is. So you have all this as-built data, and geospatially, it's not accurate. Okay,
Mhm.
but every day in every municipality, they're out there and they're locating utilities and pipelines, but they're just putting paint marks on the ground.
Mhm.
With our technology, what we're doing is we're capturing precisely from the locate devices where that utility and pipeline is. Because we're capturing it digitally, we can then push it back if they do have a GIS system, and they can
Mhm.
look at it, they can rectify their records. And over time, they would have really an accurate picture of where all their assets are. For example, let's say that it says the gas line's on this side of the street, but when the locator goes out and locates it, it's on the other side of the street. Well,
Mhm.
then that's an indicator that they need to go out and map exactly where it is and then update their records. And then for smaller municipalities, if they don't have a GIS system, we are the GIS system.
Mhm.
Makes
And
sense.
we're really super low cost. It's very affordable, easy to use. And that's why we're starting to onboard quite a few smaller municipalities. I mean, we do have the perfect solution for a smaller municipality based on easy use and the fact that it's such a low cost.
Mhm.
If we really dig into it, Paige, besides just the technology and having that technology, we really get down to the nitty gritty. We're talking about surveyors and locators. Can you guys kind of elaborate on the difference between that? Is what's the I mean, to me, I'm not that well versed in all this, but sounds like the same thing.
I can take a run at it. So, I mean, historically, when a locator goes out, they're just locating where the utility or pipeline is located, and they're putting a paint mark on the ground.
Mhm.
And so, just based on human error, if you will, because you've got your locator in one hand and you probably got your spray paint can in the other hand. At best, once they put the paint mark on the ground, it might be accurate to 1 meter, but they're also not capturing any other additional information. So, in some cases, we don't know if they located the correct utility line because
Mhm.
currency and frequency can jump. So, you might be thinking that you're capturing, power line, but you might actually be picking up, a cable line. As a result of that, again, the American Society for Civil Engineers, they don't consider a paint mark an indication of where a utility or pipeline is located. What they want is they want subsurface utility engineering business principles applied, which
Mhm.
in most cases means you have to have an engineer or surveyor out there, and they actually have to expose the utility or the pipeline so that they can have a visual of it. And then, as Justin mentioned, they want someone to take notes on exactly where it is, use a reference, and also have a photo so that they can see that it was actually exposed and where it was. What we've done is we have designed a software that integrates into those locate devices. And when you're locating it using a precision GPS, not the GPS, that chip that's embedded in your smartphone device, we can get down to centimeter accuracy, which gets into survey grade, which is about 1 to 6 centimeters. So what we're doing is while they're locating the utility, based on our software, we can capture that information based on subsurface utility engineering standards, and it meets the qualifications of an engineer or a surveyor. So you don't need the engineer or the surveyor out on the project. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking about all the things that would be going on in an engineer's mind. We kind of alluded to this before we started the podcast of like,
Mhm.
you know, the technology is always appeared as a threat now to jobs or careers and things like that, but
Yeah.
it is to make it efficient. So Justin, if hearing these type of things from Paige, w- what do you think are the reluctancies, to not adopting this stuff?
I would just say it would be more, how can you alluded to, it's the job security in that sense. So we kind of mentioned in my other podcast, in the other podcast that we did, that because I was going out there capturing, these assets at centimeter grade, using a tremble and collecting that data. But they were very reluctant to help out because, again, they knew where those assets were at that particular time and place, and they kind of safeguarded it in a sense where, hey, if I'm the only one that does know this, they're always going to rely on me. So even in that aspect, that was just with just operators. Now when you're talking about with engineers and stuff like that, that partnership, like say with even rural communities, I'm asking engineers, hey, can I get any of the CAD files from your as builds? And they're very reluctant to give me that. I get a lot of pushback, and they'll even charge me an arm and a leg to get it. And it's like, okay, this is the system's information. Why wouldn't you give that up? It's kind of like that public, what I call it, where the public would want to have that information again.
The FOIA?
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just one of those things where you're going to have a lot of pushback and reluctancy because, again, the technology is taking away other people's kind of livelihoods in that sense. Because, again, if you're able to go out there and collect the data yourself using centimeter grade, you know that's a surveyor's job already lost in a sense. Or, hey, the engineer's out there collecting all this data, it's a job that he loses. So that's where I kind of see that pushback in a sense, is that the more this technology gets more available, people are more reluctant because they're seeing their job security going out the window.
Justin, do you feel like this could be something that would change your career? I mean, you do a lot of different things just besides underground, but just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, no, like even say like with AI, um, I'm somewhat hesitant with AI because, again, I do a lot of the GIS drawings myself, and AI can actually do it itself. And that's where you kind of feel like that pushback, like, hey, maybe I'm a little reluctant to use it. But then again, I have to look at it the other side. It makes my job more efficient in a sense. Hey, if I'm not spending as much time doing, these staring at a screen drawing or digitizing these as builds over, I'm not spending that much time. I can use it more towards, educating these systems how to use the GIS or these other softwares or other technologies for their benefit.
Yeah, at the end of the day, anytime you create efficiencies in workflows and business practices that are, well entrenched and somewhat antiquated, what it does is it creates opportunity to do more work is really what it comes down because you're more
Yeah.
efficient. And it's the same with these engineering and construction companies. There's no shortage of construction projects, and with this infrastructure bill, there's going to be, a large amount of construction projects that are going to start kicking off. We know that we have to replace a large majority of our aging water and sewage systems. We have hundreds of thousands of miles of fiber optic going into the ground every year. In some cases, what there's a bottleneck of projects. They can't get to them all because they don't have enough engineers and surveyors. So if you can actually create efficiencies in the workflows and address the bottleneck,
Mm-hmm.
they can actually do more work. And that's where technology
Mm-hmm.
comes in, right? I mean, in our life, we all are threatened by technology.
Yeah.
But once we start using it, we realize the value that it provides. And in most cases, what it does is just it creates efficiencies, which means you can get more work done. You can do it
Mm-hmm.
better. You can provide a better deliverable to your customer. But I think
Mm-hmm.
we're all familiar with the resistance for change. But once we try something and we see how it benefits our lives and the value that it provides, then we embrace it.
Yeah. I get a lot of positive feedback even when after I'm done with a project. Like say, I go out there and I GPS all those their water meters. I get calls back from these systems. Hey, the map that you design, it is very beneficial. I no longer have to go through my billing software to find out who a customer belongs to this. I can just zoom in on the map and find it at ease. Operators, when they're having to do, their shut-offs or do any kind of repairs, having that technology at their fingertip, it just made it more beneficial in their part. And that's where they got they saw the light in the sense in that, like, hey, as much as we saw this as a threat, it's actually making our job a lot easier in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
I think, years ago, just like any technology, um, it was expensive, right? And
Yeah.
also maybe difficult to learn. But where technology is today, because how quickly it accelerates, it becomes, more cost effective, easier to learn. And
Yep.
there's no reason why every single municipality shouldn't have a GIS system and know precisely where everything is based on a digital record, and then be able to share that information with anybody that needs it too. Because again,
Exactly.
it's not just about efficiencies. When you're talking municipalities, government agencies, you're also talking about, public and environmental safety as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say when Justin, you mentioned CAD files from an engineering firm, they wouldn't give it up to you. I ran into similar situations when I was helping the utility. I was like, let's go to the engineering firm and try and get your GIS data. They were like, no. And I was like thinking to myself, wait a minute. The utility owner paid the engineering firm for building the GIS system, but they can't get their own data. It made no sense to me. I was just like, you got to be kidding me right now.
I came across that with, say, with crawlers, when you're using to inspect a sewer line.
Yeah.
We would record all that data, find all the using NASCO coding system, and all that was built into their software. I was like thinking to myself, oh, okay, well, we have the sewer IDs. I can export that out as a CSV, plug it into our GIS software real easily. Nope, hit a roadblock. It's a proprietary data format,
Wow.
and when I asked them, like, hey, why can't I get access to this? It's our own information. They just said, hey, it's our data. Like, what do you mean it's your data? I thought it was ours. We're collecting it all, but no, they were charging anywhere from 30 to 80 grand to access their GIS software or to get that exported out into a shapefile.
I think we're in a world right now, Paige, from what I'm learning too, is the data is obviously considered very valuable to the public sector, but the or the private sector, but the public sector hasn't caught up to it yet to make sure that they actually have a good data management system because it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like a free for all right now.
Yeah.
They do need a place like whether it's a technology that has all the data sitting into it that can be given to the private sector vendors or whoever is like using it, but it always should be coming back in return. But we don't have that kind of system in place yet. So
Yeah, just to give you an analogy on that. So, Colorado State, Colorado Department of Transportation, actually mandated our software in the
nice.
state of Colorado. So the way that works is that if you're on a state right of way and you're installing a new utility, or you're going out and locating an existing utility, you're required by law to use our software and then provide that information back to the state. So they know precisely where everything is, and they can also monitor and make sure that it is where it's supposed to be. If it's an existing line, or if it's a new installation, that it's going into the ground exactly where they gave them permission to do it. And it's creating a significant amount of value to the state and also creating workflow efficiencies because once that information is in their system and there's another project going on, then what they can do is they can share that information with the contractor
Exactly.
so that they can see where everything is. And it's beneficial for pre-design. So because a lot of times, they'll design, as we mentioned, where something's going to go in the ground. But when they get out into the real world, they realize that, there's a lot of anomalies out there that affect it. It's nice to have that information prior to
Yes.
make your adjustments. So that's what our system enables.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, because that's what I'm seeing now, and not just on the asset management, data part of it, where we're consistently, we know where it is, but the the procurement side to it, because something's going to need maintenance, something's going to need repaired. Think about all that too, because if that data
It
is,
allows a level of
yeah,
quality assurance in that sense,
yeah,
because again, you can see that data readily available, and you can see all the repairs that are done to it. So even before you start even doing your excavation, you can properly plan out. Hey, it seems like this line has taken a banging for a couple of years. Maybe we need to be extra cautious when we're approaching this. It gives that level of assurance to anybody who's starting a project.
I guess what I was
Well, in
going,
addition,
what I
go
was
ahead.
going to touch on with that one though, on the procurement side, as you guys were
So,
saying, if a vendor, like you said, the software like of a CCTV robotic camera company has that data and
mhm,
they start sharing it with other vendors, and it's because it's repairs and maintenance, like that's a
mhm.
huge advantage for a vendor to get their hands on. If you really start to think about it, then they know what within that utility what's going on, gives them a huge competitive advantage. So something to think about.
And, and,
Well,
and no, and that's something that we kind of do with, say, our tank inspections. So when we go out to our members, we do it for an affordable price using the drones to capture all the images inside the water tank itself. And then again, we give them a list of all these vendors that can provide, any kind of service that they may need. And we ask them prior, we are not giving out their data ahead of time, but we ask them like, hey, whoever you do choose, would you like us to give them, the videos that we took, the photos that we took of all the deficiencies that we found? And that just helps out their vendors out as well, because now before they even step into the project, they already have, that knowledge beforehand.
You were going to say something, Paige?
no, I was just going to mention that part of the reluctance also is for some of these companies is they're sensitive about what data is being shared. They don't want to share all their data. So what we did in our system is we built in what we call roles and privileges. So
Yeah.
you could say, for example, go to an area where the project is. You can geofence it, and then you can determine who gets to see that information
Mm,
and for how long. And then you can limit what information they're seeing as well. So we've built pretty sophisticated security into the system as well, because security is a big issue, especially for the utility and pipeline companies.
no
Mm-hmm.
doubt about that. That's for sure. Well, guys, we're almost out of time here. We actually are. But is there anything else we want to talk about before we kind of roll out?
No, I think this is great. I always refer to it as anytime there's new technology out there, it always starts with early adoption. And most of the companies that are adopting our software now are actually the engineering and surveying companies. But initially, they were the hardest sell because of
Mm-hmm.
the issues and pushback that we mentioned earlier as far as change, and also not believing that we can get centimeter accuracy on a mobile device in real time, because there's a lot of calculations that have to go into it. I mean, we have to measure the curvature of the earth. I mean, we're picking up the depth. We have to do all of this in real time. But we've got that early adoption. Now we're starting to get municipalities that are starting to adopt it, and you can see the digital transformation is happening. It always happens slow, happens steadily, but then eventually everyone realizes that they're going to have to make this change, or they're going to be left behind. So I mean, we're on the precipice of this digital transformation. It's coming, and as I mentioned, technology is just becoming more cost effective, easier to use. So I think we're going to see a rapid increase in the amount of adoption, and particularly with these small rural communities, because they're the ones that really need this information. I mean, we got to get them off these paper map systems and get them into a digital system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Justin?
And just to kind of piggyback off of Page, the what I'm seeing in rural communities now is that they're now becoming more proponents for this change with technology and whatnot. I've been seeing an up uh, interest for GIS mapping and using drone technology as whatnot. And when I start showing them the applications that GIS can have for their systems, that's where they're 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 diving into it, and I'm seeing a lot of them starting to develop their own asset management programs, and they're basing a lot of their capital improvement plans based off of that. So I'm seeing them a lot of rural systems very they're coming to the change. and it's just one of those things where it's we need to slowly introduce them to it, but they'll hop on that bus.
Sounds good, guys. This is a great episode. Just really getting deep into the information about where it kind of starts and where it ends. So appreciate your time, both of you, for joining on this episode, and truly hope you guys have a great weekend.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Stay blessed.
Thanks, Jeff.
Appreciate it.